Hello there and welcome to the Sleepy Universe. Tonight we drift into one long night inside ancient Rome, somewhere in its great imperial centuries, from dusk to first light. As the sun sinks, a strange law wakes the streets. For the first time all day, heavy carts are finally allowed to enter the city. Picture, if you will, the sun beginning its slow descent behind the low hills to the west of the city. Its last warm light sliding across red tile roofs and pale marble facades until the whole skyline seems, for a few unhurried minutes, to glow from within. This is Rome in its imperial prime, a city of perhaps 1 million people crowded onto 7 hills and the low ground between them, the largest urban settlement the ancient world had ever produced. Tonight belongs to no single emperor and no single year, but borrows gently from the long, layered span of Roman history, so that we might feel the particular hush of one composite evening without needing to sort the centuries too carefully. Smoke from 10,000 small kitchen fires still drifts upward here and there, thinning now as the heat of the day finally loosens its grip on the crowded valleys between the hills. What matters is only this, that the sun is going down now, gently, the way it always has, over a city built from stone and ambition alike, settling as we are into rest. There is a quiet comfort in resting a moment with this thought before we move softly onward. The Tiber River curls through the heart of the city in a long, patient bend, its slow brown current the very reason Rome could exist here at all. A navigable waterway connecting the settlement to the sea, some 15 miles downstream at Ostia and Portus. As dusk deepens, the river catches the day's last light in long streaks of amber and gray, its surface disturbed only by the low wake of barges still working their way upstream, laden with grain, wine, and marble drawn from every corner of the empire. Small wooden landings line both banks, worn smooth by generations of dock workers, while warehouses called horia rise nearby, their thick walls built specifically to keep stored grain cool and dry through the changing seasons. The Tiber Island sits mid-current like a permanent anchored ship home since early times to a temple of the healing god Aesculapius, where the sick were once said to come seeking rest and recovery. Tonight, as always, the river simply continues its unhurried course beneath the darkening sky, indifferent to empire, carrying the city's water and its goods onward exactly as it has for 1,000 years. Let this small detail settle now, unhurried, before we continue softly on. Among the many bridges crossing this same patient river stands the Pons Fabricius, built in the year 62 before our era and still, remarkably, carrying foot traffic across the Tiber onto the small island today, making it one of the oldest bridges anywhere still used for its original purpose. Its 2 wide stone arches were engineered with a confidence that still impresses modern observers, dressed tough and travertine fitted so precisely that the bridge required almost no significant repair for centuries after its builder, a man named Lucius Fabricius, saw it completed. Such bridges mattered enormously to a city without wheeled traffic allowed during daylight hours, since foot travelers, litter bearers, and pack animals still needed reliable crossings at every hour to keep goods and people moving between the river's 2 crowded banks. As evening settles fully now, a few last pedestrians cross unhurried in the fading light, their sandals echoing softly against old stone that has borne this same quiet weight for well over 2,000 years. It is a small, patient fact, offered gently, with nothing more required of you than simply to listen. From the high ground of the Palatine Hill, where emperors and wealthy families kept their grandest homes, the whole sweep of the darkening city can be seen falling gradually into shadow, the forum below already dim between its temples and courts, the distant hills beyond the walls softening into a blue haze as the light continues to fade. This particular hill held, according to old and cherished tradition, the very spot where Rome itself was first founded, a legend the Romans told and retold with genuine affection even as their city grew into something the founders could scarcely have imagined. Wealthy households here enjoyed gardens, fountains, and painted rooms that caught the evening breeze far more gently than the crowded streets below, where heat and noise lingered long after sunset in the narrow spaces between tall buildings. Tonight, from this same quiet vantage, torches are only now beginning to appear one by one across the darkening valley, small warm points of light scattered through a city slowly settling into its nighttime rhythm. Nothing here needs to be remembered carefully, only received quietly, the way this whole night is meant to be received. The colors spreading now across the western sky deserve a slow moment of their own, since Roman evenings, especially in the warmer months, often carried a particular golden haze born of dust and distant sea air drifting inland from the coast at Ostia, catching the low sun in soft bands of rose, amber, and deepening violet. Poets of the age wrote often and fondly of such evenings, the philosopher and statesman Seneca among them, describing the particular pleasure of watching daylight soften gradually rather than vanish all at once, a small daily gift he considered worth genuine attention amid the busyness of Roman life. Cypress trees and umbrella pines standing along garden walls turned slowly to dark silhouettes against this fading glow, their outlines familiar and calming to anyone who has watched a Roman sunset from a quiet terrace or rooftop. There is no rush to any of this, the way there never has been, the whole enormous sky settling by degrees into the calm blue-black of night above this same ancient, crowded city. There is nothing urgent in any of this, only the slow, steady unfolding of one more small and gentle truth. As true darkness gathers, the temperature within the city begins its own gradual, welcome decline, since the thick stone and packed earth that held the day's heat so stubbornly through the afternoon now begin, slowly, to release it back into the cooling evening air. Wealthier Romans often retreated at this hour to shaded courtyards or garden rooms built specifically to catch whatever breeze the evening offered, their walls sometimes painted with garden scenes so vivid that the boundary between painted plant and living one grew pleasantly uncertain in the dim, flattering light. Ordinary households, crowded into upper floors of tall apartment buildings we will visit more closely later tonight, found what relief they could near open windows, their rooms slowly losing the oppressive warmth that had gathered there since midday beneath sun-baked tile roofs. Somewhere across the city, a fountain continues its steady, unhurried trickle into a stone basin, its small persistent sound one of the most familiar and comforting notes of any Roman evening, then as now. Rest with this a moment longer, unhurried, before the night carries us softly toward its next quiet detail. Beyond the city's ancient walls, the surrounding countryside, the Roman Campagna, begins to settle into its own particular hush. Farms and modest country villas growing quiet as laborers finish their final tasks and animals are led into shelter for the night. The low, steady sound of distant sheep bells carrying faintly on the cooling evening air. Wealthy Romans often kept country estates within a day's travel of the city, retreating there during the hottest months to escape the noise and crowding of urban life, their villas equipped with gardens, orchards, and sometimes small private baths built expressly for quiet, restorative rest. Roads radiating outward from the city, engineered with remarkable skill and durability, Some sections still walkable today after 2,000 years, carry the last few travelers of the day toward inns and rest stops scattered at reliable intervals along their length. Tonight, that same patient countryside stretches away into the deepening dark beyond the city walls, its farms and villas settling into stillness just as surely, if a good deal more quietly, than the crowded city itself. It asks nothing of you now except your calm attention, offered freely, before we drift onward together. Along the riverbank itself, evening brings its own familiar chorus. The low croak of frogs rising from marshy stretches near the water, waterfowl settling into reeds for the night, and somewhere nearby the steady creak of a dockside crane still being secured after a long day spent unloading heavy cargo from barges arriving up the Tiber's patient current. Dock workers, many of them organized into associations that managed particular trades, from grain handling to marble hauling, finish their labor here as darkness falls, some heading home to nearby apartments while others remain to guard valuable cargo through the night against theft or accident. The scent of the river itself, muddy and faintly brackish where it nears the sea, mingles now with wood smoke and the occasional drift of cooking oil from a riverside stall still serving its last customers of the evening. Tonight, this same soft mixture of water sound and settling activity marks the boundary between the working day and the quieter night ahead, a transition the Tiber has witnessed patiently for as long as this city has stood beside it. Such small, steady facts are exactly what this long night is made of, one gentle thought following another. Near the river's edge stood the great old cattle market, the Forum Boreum, and not far beyond it the enormous Circus Maximus, its long oval track now standing empty and silent, the roaring crowds of an afternoon's chariot races long since dispersed quietly into the surrounding streets and taverns. This vast arena, capable of holding well over 100,000 spectators at its height, dominated the low ground between the Palatine and Aventine hills, its tiered stone seating now catching only the faint last light of evening across row after empty row. Race days brought extraordinary crowds and extraordinary noise to this part of the city, yet by full darkness the great structure had returned, as it always did, to a patient and rather grand emptiness, waiting for its next scheduled event weeks or months away. Tonight, a lone watchman or two may still walk its perimeter out of simple habit, their footsteps the only sound within a space built to hold the shouted enthusiasm of an entire city. Let it settle now, slowly and completely, before we turn our attention to whatever waits gently ahead. So here we are then at the true beginning of our long night's journey, the sun fully down now behind the western hills, the Tiber flowing dark and steady beneath its ancient bridges, and the whole vast city beginning to shift, block by block, into the different rhythm that governs its hours of darkness. Something rather unusual is about to happen in the streets below, a change so ordinary to Roman ears that hardly anyone still pauses to notice it, though it shaped daily life in this city more thoroughly than almost any other single rule. We will step into that change together in the chapter just ahead, following the sound of iron-rimmed wheels finally permitted onto stone pavement after a long day of enforced daytime quiet. Carry this settled river and this darkening skyline forward with you now, sky and water and quiet, waiting hills, as we turn toward the streets themselves and the particular kind of nighttime traffic that only Rome, among ancient cities, managed in quite this way. Hold this gently for a moment, the way the whole evening itself seems content simply to be held. Somewhere around the middle of the 1st century before our era, Julius Caesar, in his role reorganizing the administration of the city, issued a measure now known to historians as the Lex Julia Municipalis. Among its many provisions, a rule forbidding wheeled vehicles from entering or moving within the city during the busy daylight hours, with only a handful of specific exceptions granted for religious processions, public construction, and a few other carefully defined circumstances. The reasoning was entirely practical, since Rome streets laborers and litter bearers going about the ordinary business of the day. This meant that the enormous volume of goods any city of 1 million people required, grain and wine, building stone and timber, pottery and furniture, had to arrive and move through the streets almost entirely after dark, transforming Roman nights into a surprisingly busy working shift most residents rarely saw firsthand. Tonight, as the sun disappears completely, that same old rule quietly takes effect once more, gates and streets alike opening to a rumbling traffic invisible to the sleeping city above it. There is no hurry here at all, only the same patient, unhurried pace this whole night has kept from the start. The Roman poet Juvenal, writing rather wryly in his own era, complained at real length about exactly this nighttime disruption, describing in one famous satire how the constant creak and rumble of carts moving through narrow streets below made genuine, restful sleep in Rome a luxury available mainly to the very wealthy, whose homes stood set back from the busiest thoroughfares behind thick garden walls. Ordinary residents living in the tall apartment buildings we will visit more closely soon had no such buffer, their upper floor windows opening directly onto streets now filled with the iron-rimmed wheels of heavy carts, grinding steadily against uneven paving stones below. Juvenal's complaint, preserved for us across nearly 2,000 years, offers a wonderfully human window into a problem that feels, in its particulars, remarkably familiar to anyone who has ever lived above a busy nighttime street in any city since. Tonight, somewhere in a cramped upper floor room, a tired resident turns over restlessly at exactly this same steady rumble, a small human frustration that has apparently changed very little across the intervening centuries. Let that settle quietly now, one more small piece of this vast, patient evening slipping softly into place. The carts themselves came in considerable variety, from simple two-wheeled carts called plaustra, pulled by a single ox or mule and suited to smaller loads, to larger four-wheeled wagons capable of hauling substantial quantities of grain, wine amphorae, or quarried stone destined for one of the city's many ongoing construction projects. Building material in particular moved almost entirely by night, since Rome under various emperors was almost constantly under some form of renovation or expansion. Temples rebuilt, forums enlarged, aqueducts extended brick, and timber delivered quietly while the daytime crowds slept. Drivers navigating this nighttime traffic relied on torches or simple oil lanterns to see their way through streets that offered no other illumination once full darkness had fallen, their careful, practiced routes worn smooth by countless previous nights spent making the very same deliveries. Tonight, somewhere near the base of one of the city's 7 hills, just such a wagon creaks slowly forward under torchlight, its driver calling low, practiced instructions to a patient, plodding ox making its way toward a construction site that will resume its daytime work again with the following dawn. It is enough for now simply to have noticed this calmly before the night moves gently on. Rome's streets themselves, called vici in their smaller residential form, were paved with a distinctive material known as basalt, hard volcanic stone, cut into interlocking polygonal blocks fitted together with remarkable precision. A paving technique the Romans used across their empire, and one still visible today in surviving stretches of ancient road. These streets curved and narrowed unpredictably between tall buildings, following the irregular contours of Rome's hills rather than any strict grid, a layout that had grown organically over centuries rather than being planned all at once from a single blank slate. Deep ruts worn gradually into the hard stone by countless generations of cart wheels passing along the very same routes night after night can still be seen in surviving ancient pavements elsewhere in the Roman world, silent evidence of exactly this kind of steady, repeated nighttime traffic. Tonight, fresh wheels add their own quiet contribution to grooves already worn deep by wheels long since rotted away. The same patient stone bearing weight it has borne, uncomplaining, for longer than any single cart driver's whole working life. Consider it settled now, one more calm, small certainty resting quietly alongside everything else we have gathered tonight. Draft animals bore the true burden of this nighttime economy, oxen prized for their strength and steady, patient temperament on longer hauls, mules favored for lighter, faster work requiring some measure of agility through the city's narrow, twisting streets. These animals were stabled, when the work allowed it, in small yards attached to warehouses or transport businesses scattered through the city's outer districts, tended by grooms and drivers who understood, from long practical experience, precisely how much a given animal could reasonably carry across a single night's careful, unhurried work. The particular sound of iron-shod hooves against stone paving, mixed with the creak of wooden axles and the low, occasional call of a driver correcting his team's course, formed one of the most characteristic and enduring background sounds of the Roman night, audible from nearly anywhere within the city at almost any hour after dark. Tonight, somewhere not far from the river, a weary mule leans briefly into its harness at a driver's soft command. Continuing patiently forward through streets, it has likely traveled countless times before under cover of exactly this same familiar darkness. This, too, belongs to the same unhurried rhythm, carrying us gently through the whole of this long night. Not every cart carried mere building material or ordinary goods, since certain exceptions to the daytime ban existed specifically for triumphal processions, honoring victorious generals returning from successful campaigns, and for the sacred vehicles of the Vestal Virgins, whose religious duties were considered important enough to override the ordinary daytime restriction entirely. Wine, too, moved through the city in considerable volume by night, amphorae stacked carefully in wooden racks aboard sturdy carts, destined for the taverns and private cellars we will visit again a little later in our own long night together. Olive oil, another staple of Roman daily life used for cooking, lighting, and bathing alike, traveled the same nighttime routes in sealed clay containers, carefully packed to prevent breakage across streets that, however skillfully paved, still offered a genuinely bumpy ride to anything fragile riding above wooden wheels. Tonight, somewhere near one of the city's grand covered markets, several such carts stand briefly at rest while their contents are unloaded by lamplight, ready and waiting for the morning crowds who will arrive here in only a few short hours. Let this small detail rest easily in your mind now, unhurried and complete, before we continue softly on. The sheer scale of Rome's daily needs made this nighttime traffic genuinely essential rather than merely convenient, since a city of roughly 1 million residents required an almost constant, uninterrupted flow of food, fuel, and building material simply to continue functioning normally from one day to the next. Grain alone, the foundation of the Roman diet in the form of bread, we will examine more closely in a later chapter, arrived by ship at the coastal port of Ostia, before being transferred onto smaller river barges, and finally onto these same nighttime carts for final distribution to bakeries and public storehouses scattered throughout the city. Firewood and charcoal, needed for cooking, moved through the same dark streets in equally steady volume, delivered by suppliers who had learned, through long practical experience, exactly which routes offered the fastest passage between the city gates and their regular customers. Tonight, this whole vast, largely invisible system continues its patient work exactly as it does every single night, sustaining a sleeping city that will wake tomorrow to find its markets and bakeries somehow, quietly, already fully stocked. It is a small, patient fact, offered gently, with nothing more required of you than simply to listen. City gates themselves, unlike the daytime restriction on wheeled traffic, generally remained open through the night for foot travelers and the carts we have been discussing, watched over by guards whose duties blended smoothly into the broader, nighttime responsibilities of the watchmen. We will meet more fully in a later chapter devoted entirely to their particular work. A traveler arriving late, whether on foot, by litter, could generally still pass through into the city itself, though the streets beyond the gates offered little in the way of formal lighting to guide their onward journey through the dark. Torches carried by servants or slaves specifically employed for exactly this purpose provided most of the illumination available to anyone moving through Rome after dark, their flickering light casting long, uneven shadows across buildings that seemed, in this dim glow, considerably taller and more mysterious than they appeared beneath the plain light of day. Tonight, one such torch bobs steadily along a narrow street, guiding a small group of servants and their master safely home from an evening engagement elsewhere in the city. Nothing here needs to be remembered carefully, only received quietly, the way this whole night is meant to be received. Alongside the wheeled traffic and its accompanying noise, Rome's nighttime streets carried their own particular population, night watchmen beginning their rounds, off-duty workers heading home after long days, and here and there a small group returning from a dinner party or evening entertainment, their path lit by servants carrying torches or simple oil lanterns ahead of them. Wealthy households sometimes employed link boys specifically for this purpose, young servants whose entire job consisted of lighting the way home through dark, a small but genuinely useful profession born entirely of the city's lack of any formal street lighting. Encounters between these various night travelers, cart drivers navigating their heavy loads and pedestrians picking their way carefully along narrow, unlit passages, required a certain practiced courtesy and caution on both sides, since a moment's carelessness in the dark could easily result in a minor accident or a spilled cargo. Tonight, somewhere near the edge of the forum, just such a careful negotiation plays out quietly between a heavy grain cart and a small party making its way home, both continuing on their separate ways after a brief, practical pause. Let it settle now, slowly and completely, before we turn our attention to whatever waits gently ahead. As this chapter of creaking wheels and torchlit streets draws softly to its close, let the whole busy, hidden shape of Rome's nighttime traffic settle now in your mind. Heavy carts rumbling steadily along worn stone streets, patient oxen and mules leaning into their harnesses, torches bobbing here and there through the general dark, and somewhere beneath it all the steady, essential rhythm of a city feeding and building itself, while most of its residents slept soundly above. This peculiar daily arrangement, whether through the noise that kept light sleepers awake or through the bread and wine that appeared, as if by quiet magic, fresh and ready each following morning. There is a particular comfort in understanding a system this old and this thoroughly, patiently organized. A whole invisible economy moving steadily through darkness so that daylight hours could remain, by contrast, reasonably calm and walkable. Carry this same rumbling, torchlit street forward with you now as we step up from ground level into the tall, crowded apartment buildings, where most of this same city's residents were only now settling in for the night. Nothing about this needs solving, only noticing calmly, before the night continues its own slow, steady pace. Rising above the narrow streets we have just wandered through stand the Insula, Rome's tall apartment buildings, sometimes reaching 5 or 6 stories into the darkening sky, their upper floors home to the great majority of the city's ordinary population living in conditions considerably more crowded and modest than the grand private houses of the wealthy. The Emperor Augustus, concerned about both fire risk and structural safety, set a legal limit on their height at roughly 70 Roman feet, a little over 20 meters. A restriction later tightened further by the Emperor Trajan following a series of serious fires and building collapses that had claimed lives across the crowded city. As evening settles fully over the streets below, small points of warm lamplight begin appearing window by window across these same tall buildings. Oil lamps being lit one household at a time as families gather in for the night within rooms that, however cramped, represented home to a very large share of Rome's entire population. Tonight, climbing narrow stairs past floor after settling floor, toward the small, warm rooms where ordinary Roman evenings were quietly, patiently unfolding. There is a quiet comfort in resting a moment with this thought before we move softly onward. These small oil lamps, called lucerni, were typically made from fired clay or, in wealthier households, from bronze, their shallow reservoirs filled with olive oil and fitted with a simple linen or flax wick drawn through a narrow spout at one end, producing a soft, warm, gently flickering light quite unlike anything electric we might know today. A single such lamp could burn steadily for several hours on a modest amount of oil, enough to illuminate a small table or a modest corner of a room, though never bright enough to banish entirely the deeper shadows gathered along the walls and ceiling above. Wealthier households sometimes owned elaborate lamp stands or hanging fixtures capable of holding several wicks at once, casting a fuller, more generous light across dinner tables and reception rooms, while poorer families made do with a single humble lamp shared among an entire household's evening needs. Tonight, picture just such a small flame now, set carefully on a low table within a cramped upper-floor apartment, its soft glow enough to guide a family gently through the last quiet tasks of an ordinary evening before sleep. Let this small detail settle now, unhurried, before we continue softly on. Fire remained the single greatest danger facing these tall, densely packed wooden and brick buildings, since open flames from cooking fires and oil lamps alike, combined with wooden floors, beams, and furnishings crowded closely together across many stories, created conditions in which a single careless accident could spread with genuinely terrifying speed through an entire block before help arrived. The Great Fire of the year 64, during the reign of the Emperor Nero, remains the most famous single example, destroying a substantial portion of the city and prompting significant reforms afterward in building codes and firefighting organization, some of which we will examine more closely when we meet the city's dedicated night watch later in our journey. Because of this ever-present risk, many Insula apartments had no proper kitchen of their own at all, residents instead relying on nearby taverns and food stalls for hot meals, rather than risking an open flame within their own crowded, flammable rooms. Tonight, in the apartment we have settled into, as every resident here has learned to be, of exactly how quickly warm light can turn into genuine danger. It is a small, patient fact, offered gently, with nothing more required of you than simply to listen. The ground floor of a typical insula usually held shops called taberni, their fronts opening directly onto the street, selling everything from bread and wine to pottery, tools, and simple household goods, often still lit faintly at this hour by a shopkeeper finishing the last tasks of a long working day. Above these shops rose the residential floors themselves, generally growing smaller, more crowded, and considerably less comfortable the higher one climbed, since the ground and first floors commanded higher rents and offered better access to the street's piped water supply below. Families living on the uppermost floors, by contrast, often occupied single cramped rooms shared among several people, climbing many flights of narrow, sometimes rickety wooden stairs each day to reach homes that, despite their modest size, still represented genuine shelter and community within the vast, crowded city. Tonight, somewhere near the top of just such a building, a small family settles onto simple mats for the night, their single room lit by the same modest lamp that has served them faithfully through countless similar evenings before this one. Nothing here needs to be remembered carefully, only received quietly, the way this whole night is meant to be received. Water presented a genuine daily challenge for residents living on these upper floors, since Rome's famously abundant piped water supply, carried into the city by its great aqueducts, generally reached only ground floor properties and public fountains scattered through the surrounding streets, leaving upper floor residents to carry every drop they needed up long flights of stairs themselves. A trip to the nearest public fountain, jug or bucket in hand, formed a regular part of daily life for a great many ordinary Romans, offering, alongside its practical purpose, a genuine opportunity for neighbors to exchange news, gossip, and simple friendly conversation while waiting their turn at the flowing spout. Tonight, with the day's water already carried and the evening's cooking, where it happened at all, already finished, that particular daily task rests until morning, the family's water jars standing filled and ready near the room's single small window. This same simple, practical rhythm, water carried carefully up narrow stairs by hand, shaped countless ordinary Roman evenings across many generations, each one settling in its own small way into rest exactly as this one now does. Let that settle quietly now, one more small piece of this vast, patient evening slipping softly into place. Furnishings within these upper floor apartments remained deliberately simple and practical. A low wooden bed frame called a lectus strung with cord or rope to support a thin mattress. Perhaps a small wooden chest for storing clothing and modest possessions, and a stool or two arranged near whatever light the single window or lamp might offer at this hour. Walls were typically finished in plain plaster, sometimes whitewashed for a bit of brightness, occasionally decorated with simple painted patterns, where a resident's means allowed for such a small, cheerful touch amid otherwise unadorned surroundings. Windows themselves rarely held glass, an expensive luxury reserved mainly for wealthier households, instead fitted with wooden shutters that could be closed against the evening chill or opened, weather permitting, to let in whatever breeze the crowded street below might offer. Tonight, in the small room we have been quietly visiting, those same wooden shutters stand half open to the cooling night air, admitting a faint city hum along with the settling darkness, now spreading steadily across every rooftop nearby. It is enough for now simply to have noticed this calmly before the night moves gently on. Sound traveled easily through these tightly packed buildings, thin walls and shared stairwells carrying the ordinary noises of neighboring households, a crying infant, a quiet conversation, the creak of floorboards overhead, into nearly every room within earshot, creating a particular kind of communal, if occasionally exhausting, closeness among residents who might otherwise have remained strangers. Neighbors in these buildings often knew one another rather well as a simple practical necessity, sharing water fetched from the same fountain, purchasing bread from the same ground floor bakery, and relying on one another for small favors and occasional assistance in a city that offered relatively little in the way of formal social services beyond the grain dole we will examine more closely in a later chapter. Tonight, somewhere within this same tall building, the muffled sound of a neighboring family's quiet evening routine drifts faintly through a shared wall, an ordinary and rather comforting reminder that this small room, however modest, sits within a larger living community settling down together for the night. This too belongs to the same unhurried rhythm, carrying us gently through the whole of this long night. Landlords, often absentee owners who never set foot in the buildings they profited from, rented these apartments through intermediary agents, collecting payment on a regular schedule, and generally investing as little as possible in maintenance or repair. A practice that occasionally drew sharp criticism from Roman writers concerned about the genuine dangers of neglected, overcrowded housing. The satirist Juvenal, whom we met earlier complaining about nighttime traffic noise, also wrote pointedly about the dangers of Insula living more broadly, describing buildings so poorly maintained that residents lived in constant, quiet anxiety about structural collapse alongside the ever-present risk of fire. Despite these genuine hardships, Insula life also offered real advantages unavailable to those living further from the city center: proximity to markets, baths, and the general bustle of urban life that many residents, whatever their complaints, still clearly valued enough to remain. Tonight, none of these larger concerns intrude on the family's simple, ordinary evening. Their attention turned instead toward the small comforts available to them: a shared meal already finished, a lamp burning low, and rest finally, gently, within reach. Consider it settled now, one more calm, small certainty resting quietly alongside everything else we have gathered tonight. Not every Insula apartment stood equally modest, since some buildings, particularly those constructed under later emperors with improved building codes and materials, offered genuinely comfortable middle-class housing, complete with small private balconies, better ventilation, and even modest decorative touches that set them apart from the cramped, bare rooms occupied by the city's poorest residents. Archaeological evidence from well-preserved Roman towns elsewhere in Italy, where volcanic ash or simple abandonment left buildings remarkably intact, shows us in vivid detail exactly how varied Insula life could be, from simple single rooms to genuinely pleasant multi-room apartments enjoyed by moderately prosperous craftsmen, shopkeepers, and minor officials. This range of circumstances meant that Insula living covered an enormous span of the city's social spectrum, from its most desperately poor residents to comfortable, respectable households, simply choosing apartment life over the greater expense and upkeep of a private house. Tonight, across the many thousands of such buildings scattered through the sleeping city, this same wide variety of circumstance settles quietly into rest, each household finding, within its own particular means, whatever small comfort the night has to offer. Rest with this a moment longer, unhurried, before the night carries us softly toward its next quiet detail. As this chapter of lamplight and narrow stairways draws softly to its close, let the whole tall, crowded shape of the Insula settle now in your mind: ground floor shops closing their shutters for the night, modest apartments rising story upon story above them, small lamps glowing here and there behind half-open windows, and somewhere within nearly every room the same simple furnishings offering whatever rest a long day's work has earned. This was sometimes precarious ordinariness, the true residential heart of ancient Rome, home to the overwhelming majority of a city whose grand marble monuments, however impressive, housed only a small fraction of its actual population. There is a particular comfort in imagining so many small, separate households settling into sleep together within these same crowded walls, each family's evening quietly its own, and yet part of something larger and more communal than any single room could contain alone. Carry this same lamplit stairway forward with you now as we step back down to street level, toward the bakeries where tomorrow's bread is only now, in the deepening dark, beginning to take careful shape. Hold this gently for a moment, the way the whole evening itself seems content simply to be held. Somewhere near the base of one of Rome's crowded hills, a bakery, or pistrinum, is only now beginning its long night's work. Flour dust already hanging faintly in lamplight as bakers, called pistors, prepare the dough that will become the following morning's essential loaves for an entire neighborhood's worth of hungry households. Baking as an organized, respected profession had developed relatively late in Roman history, emerging as a distinct trade around the middle of the 2nd century before our era, when a formal guild called the Collegium Pistorum was established to regulate and support the growing number of professional bakers serving the city's enormous population. Before this development, a practice that gradually gave way as the city grew ever larger and busier, to reliance on dedicated professional bakeries capable of producing bread in far greater volume and consistency than any single household kitchen. Tonight, in bakeries scattered across every district of the city, this same patient, practiced work continues quietly through the dark hours, flour and water in careful hands preparing, loaf by loaf, for a morning that has not yet arrived. There is no hurry here at all, only the same patient, unhurried pace this whole night has kept from the start. Grain itself reached these bakeries through an enormous and carefully managed supply chain. Wheat grown in the fertile provinces of Egypt and North Africa, loaded aboard large grain ships bound for the Roman port of Ostia, then transferred onto smaller vessels for the final journey up the Tiber into the city's great storage warehouses, or horia, built specifically to keep such vital supplies dry and secure. A portion of this grain supported the famous annona, a public distribution program providing free or heavily subsidized grain and later baked bread directly to a substantial number of Roman citizens, a system that helped keep the city's enormous and potentially restless population fed and generally calm. Bakeries supplying this public program worked under particular oversight and expectation, their nighttime labor directly tied to the following morning's distribution, a responsibility that added genuine weight to the otherwise humble, repetitive work of grinding and kneading carried out through these quiet, flowery hours. Tonight, sacks of grain already delivered by yesterday's nighttime cart traffic stand ready near the bakery's grinding stones by morning, produce the loaves an entire grateful neighborhood depends upon. Let that settle quietly now, one more small piece of this vast, patient evening slipping softly into place. Grinding grain into usable flour required considerable physical effort, accomplished largely through rotary mills called mola asenaria, tall hourglass-shaped stones turned steadily by donkeys or mules walking in slow, patient circles around a central axis. Their steady plodding rhythm, one of the most characteristic sounds emerging from any working bakery at this hour. Some bakeries employed enslaved or hired laborers to assist alongside these animals, managing the flow of grain into the grinding mechanism and gathering the resulting flour for the kneading and shaping that would follow, a genuinely demanding sequence of physical tasks repeated night after patient night. The remarkable tomb of a baker named Eurysaces, still standing today near what was once the Porta Maggiore, offers a striking and unusually personal glimpse into this trade, its unusual design incorporating shapes recalling the very grain measures and kneading troughs central to his prosperous, hard-won profession. Tonight in the bakery we have been quietly visiting circular turning, flour gathering steadily beneath it while the patient animal that powers the whole simple mechanism plods onward through the dark, largely unaware of the essential, humble service it provides. It is enough for now simply to have noticed this calmly before the night moves gently on. Once ground and mixed with water, salt, and a portion of previously fermented dough serving as a natural leavening agent, The bread dough itself required careful, practiced kneading, often accomplished with the aid of simple mechanical kneading troughs that helped ease the physical burden of preparing dough in the large quantities a busy public bakery required each single night. Different grades of flour, more or less finely sifted darker bread, closer in character to the whole grain itself, fed the greater portion of the city's ordinary population through the humble public distribution system. Shaped loaves, often round and sometimes scored across the top into distinct wedge-shaped sections for easy sharing, were set aside now to rest and rise further before their turn came in the bakery's waiting ovens. A process requiring patience and careful timing that experienced bakers had learned to judge almost entirely by touch and long, practiced habit. Tonight, rows of such shaped loaves sit quietly under cloth in the bakery's back room, rising slowly and steadily toward the moment, still some hours off, when they will finally meet the oven's waiting heat. Consider it settled now, one more calm, small certainty resting quietly alongside everything else we have gathered tonight. The ovens themselves, called ferni, were typically dome-shaped structures built from brick and thick clay, heated first by burning wood or charcoal directly inside the chamber until the surrounding material had absorbed enough heat, after which the embers were carefully swept aside to make room for the actual loaves, baked instead by the oven's own retained, steady warmth rather than any open flame. This careful two-stage process, heating first and baking second, required real skill and experience to manage correctly, since too little initial heat left bread undercooked, while too much risked a burnt, ruined batch representing hours of careful earlier labor entirely wasted. Bakers judged the oven's readiness through long practiced habit, sometimes by simply holding a hand briefly near the opening or observing the particular color of the glowing brick within, a skill passed down through years of apprenticeship within this demanding, essential trade. Tonight in the bakery we have been following, just such an oven glows warmly in one corner, its embers being carefully swept aside, even now in preparation for the first patient batch of the night's long, careful work. Rest with this a moment longer, unhurried, before the night carries us softly toward its next quiet detail. Bread formed the true, unshakable center of the ordinary Roman diet, eaten at nearly every meal alongside olive oil, a bit of cheese, vegetables, or simple cured meat when a household's means allowed for such modest additions. Its steady, reliable presence on the table, one of the few genuine constants shared across nearly every level of Roman society. The particular grade and quality of bread a person ate said a great deal, in practice finer white loaves signaling greater wealth and status. A simple, visible distinction understood immediately by anyone sharing a meal or passing a market stall. Public bakeries supplying the free grain distribution program worked to a genuinely enormous scale. Some historians estimating that this system, at its height, supported well over 200,000 Roman citizens with regular grain or bread allocations, a logistical achievement of real and lasting significance for the ancient world. Tonight, the modest bakery we have been visiting represents just one small, essential node within this vast citywide system. Its own quiet nighttime labor a small but genuine contribution to keeping an enormous, hungry city reliably, patiently fed. Let this small detail rest easily in your mind now, unhurried and complete, before we continue softly on. Bakers themselves occupied a respected, if physically demanding, position within Roman society, their guild offering genuine social standing and, for successful practitioners, real prosperity, as demonstrated vividly by Eurysaces and his unusually grand tomb, evidence that hard work within even a humble trade could, under the right circumstances, lead to genuine and lasting success. Many bakeries were family businesses, passed down across generations, with sons learning the trades, many careful skills, grinding, kneading directly from fathers who had themselves learned the very same lessons decades earlier within these same warm, flour-dusted rooms. Enslaved workers, too, formed a significant part of the bakery workforce in many establishments, their labor considerably less celebrated than that of free bakers like Urisaces, though no less essential to the steady, nightly production this whole enormous system depended upon completely. Tonight in the bakery we have quietly followed through these early hours. A father and his teenage son work steadily side by side near the glowing oven. The younger, already skilled enough to manage the careful timing this ancient trade has always demanded of its patient practitioners. It is a small, patient fact, offered gently, with nothing more required of you than simply to listen. Beyond ordinary daily bread, Roman bakers also produced a genuine variety of other baked goods, flat bread suited to particular dishes, sweetened cakes flavored with honey and dried fruit for festivals and special occasions, and specialized breads shaped or marked for particular religious offerings, since bread itself held a modest but real ceremonial role in various Roman religious practices alongside its everyday nutritional importance. Recipes and techniques varied somewhat by region and by individual bakery, with certain establishments earning particular local reputations for especially fine or distinctive bread, much as bakeries and their specialties continue to earn devoted followings in cities everywhere today. Market stalls near major public spaces sometimes sold bread directly to shoppers throughout the day, restocked periodically from nearby bakeries as morning supplies gradually sold through. A small but steady daytime rhythm built entirely upon the nighttime labor we have been quietly observing. Tonight, alongside the plain, a smaller batch of something sweeter rests nearby as well, prepared for a household somewhere nearby marking a birthday or a small family celebration with a bit of extra care. This too belongs to the same unhurried rhythm, carrying us gently through the whole of this long night. As the night wears on, bakeries across the city settle into their own steady, practiced rhythm, oven after oven cycling through its careful sequence of heating and baking, loaf after loaf emerging warm and fragrant to cool briefly before being stacked, counted, and readied for the morning distribution that will begin again with the very first light. This nighttime labor, largely invisible to the sleeping households whose morning meal depends entirely upon it, represents one of the ancient city's quietest and most essential forms of care. A whole trade organized around ensuring that Rome's enormous population woke each morning to bread that had, quite literally, only just finished baking. The particular warm scent of fresh bread, drifting from bakery doorways into otherwise quiet nighttime streets, must have offered its own small, welcome comfort to anyone passing by at this late hour somewhere nearby, was steadily, patiently preparing for the morning ahead. Tonight, that same warm scent drifts now from more than one bakery scattered across the sleeping city, a quiet promise carried gently on the cooling night air toward whoever happens to catch it. Nothing here needs to be remembered carefully, only received quietly, the way this whole night is meant to be received. As this chapter of flour and warm ovens draws softly to its close, let the whole patient, fragrant shape of the nighttime bakery settle now in your mind. Patient animals turning grinding stones in slow, steady circles, dough rising quietly beneath cloth in a warm back room, and glowing ovens cycling steadily through their careful, practiced work as loaf after loaf takes shape in the deepening dark. This whole enormous ground and kneaded and baked through the quiet hours existed for one simple, essential purpose: ensuring that an entire enormous city woke each morning to bread it could genuinely depend upon. There is a particular comfort in imagining so many small, humble hands working steadily through the night, in service of something as ordinary and essential as tomorrow's breakfast. A form of care so constant and so reliable that most Romans likely gave it very little conscious thought at all. Carry this same warm, flowery scent forward with you now as we step toward the great bathing halls where the city's other essential daily comfort, hot water, was being carefully, patiently maintained through this same long night. Nothing about this needs solving, only noticing calmly, before the night continues its own slow, steady pace. Rising grandly above their surrounding neighborhoods stand Rome's great public bathing complexes. The Thermae, vast structures offering not merely bathing facilities but libraries, gardens, exercise grounds, and gathering spaces that together formed one of the true centers of ordinary Roman social life, open to citizens of nearly every social class for a genuinely modest entrance fee. Complexes built under emperors such as Agrippa, and later expanded magnificently under others, could accommodate many hundreds or even thousands of bathers at once. Their soaring vaulted ceilings and richly decorated interiors, representing some of the most impressive engineering and architectural achievement the ancient world ever produced for the simple, universal purpose of getting clean. As evening deepens and the day's crowds have long since dispersed homeward, these same grand halls stand largely empty now, their marble floors and painted walls holding only the quiet, lingering warmth of a busy day now finished, while a smaller dedicated staff continues working carefully behind the scenes to prepare for tomorrow. Tonight its usual daytime bustle replaced now by a hushed, echoing calm broken only by the steady, distant work still continuing somewhere below. There is a quiet comfort in resting a moment with this thought before we move softly onward. The remarkable warmth that made Roman bathing genuinely comfortable, even luxurious, depended entirely on an ingenious engineering system called the hypocaust, in which raised floors rested atop short brick or stone pillars called pilli, creating a hollow space beneath through which hot air and smoke from a dedicated furnace, the prefernium, could circulate freely, gently warming the floor, and through hollow flues built into the walls, the room's air as well. This system required constant, careful tending, maintaining a level of heat that would allow the following day's first bathers to step onto genuinely warm floors and into properly heated water without any lengthy delay. The engineering skill required to design and maintain such a system, balancing fuel consumption, airflow, and heat retention across an enormous complex, represented a genuinely sophisticated technical achievement, one that would not be matched in much of the world again for well over 1,000 years after Rome's own eventual decline. Tonight, deep beneath the quiet marble halls above, that same careful, steady fire tending continues without pause, workers moving methodically between furnace and fuel store through hours most bathers above would never think to consider. Let this small detail settle now, unhurried, before we continue softly on. A typical visit to the baths followed a fairly consistent sequence, beginning in the apoditerium, a changing room where clothing and belongings were left, sometimes watched by a hired attendant before moving through progressively warmer rooms, the mild tepidarium, the genuinely hot caldarium with its heated pools and hypocaust-warmed floors, and finally, for those wanting the bracing contrast, the cold plunge of the frigidarium, its unheated pool offering a sharp, invigorating finish to the whole careful sequence. Bathers cleaned themselves not with soap, which remained relatively uncommon in this era, using a curved metal tool called a strigil, a practice requiring either a skilled attendant's help or considerable personal flexibility to manage alone. This whole sequence, moving deliberately from warm to hot to cold, was understood by Roman physicians and ordinary bathers alike to offer genuine health benefits, alongside the simple pleasure of getting properly clean, a belief that shaped bathing practice consistently across many centuries of Roman life. Tonight, these same rooms stand quiet and empty, their pools stilled and cooling gradually, waiting patiently for tomorrow's careful sequence to begin again with the returning crowds. It is a small, patient fact, offered gently, with nothing more required of you than simply to listen. Public baths generally operated on a fairly consistent daily schedule, opening around midday and remaining busy through the afternoon hours, when most Romans had finished their morning work and social obligations, and could turn their attention properly toward relaxation, exercise, and unhurried conversation with friends encountered along the way. Entrance fees were kept deliberately modest, often just a small coin called a quadrans, ensuring that bathing remained genuinely accessible even to Rome's poorer residents, while certain emperors periodically offered free public bathing on particular holidays or in celebration of specific occasions, grateful crowds. By evening, as the light outside faded and residents turned their attention toward the evening meal and the coming night, these same crowded halls gradually emptied, attendants beginning the considerable work of cleaning, restocking, and preparing the whole enormous complex for its next busy day of operation. Tonight, that emptying process has long since finished, the bath's great halls settling into exactly the kind of hushed, echoing quiet that only a space built for many hundreds of people can produce when it stands, for a few hours, genuinely alone. Nothing here needs to be remembered carefully, only received quietly, the way this whole night is meant to be received. Water itself arrived at these grand complexes through Rome's remarkable aqueduct system, a subject we will return to more fully in a later chapter devoted entirely to the city's hidden hydraulic engineering, flowing continuously by gravity alone from distant mountain springs into vast storage cisterns, before being distributed carefully throughout the bath's many interconnected pools and channels. This continuous flow meant that Roman baths generally offered genuinely fresh, constantly circulating water rather than standing pools reused repeatedly by successive bathers. A genuine sanitary advantage achieved through careful engineering rather than any particular daily effort on the part of the bathing staff themselves. Overflow from the baths pools was typically channeled onward into the city's sewer system, which we will also visit again shortly, meaning that even Rome's considerable bathing needs fit neatly into the broader, patient cycle of water moving steadily through and eventually out of the city. Tonight, that same continuous, gentle flow continues quietly through darkened channels and stilled pools alike, water moving steadily onward exactly as it does at every hour, indifferent to whether any bather happens to be present to enjoy it. Let it settle now, slowly and completely, before we turn our attention to whatever waits gently ahead. Beyond their purely practical bathing function, these grand complexes served as genuine social centers. Their attached gardens, exercise grounds called palistri, and sometimes even libraries offering Romans of nearly every background a shared, comfortable space for conversation, business discussion, and simple, unhurried leisure that few other public spaces in the ancient city could quite match. Friends might arrange to meet regularly at a favorite bathing complex, combining exercise, bathing, and genuine social connection into a single pleasant afternoon routine that many Romans considered among the true, simple pleasures of city living, regardless of their particular social standing or profession. Vendors selling snacks, drinks, and small goods often gathered near the entrances of the busiest complexes, catching the steady flow of bathers arriving and departing throughout the day, adding their own small commercial bustle to the bath's broader social atmosphere. Tonight, with those same crowds long departed and those same vendors packed up for the evening, The complex's gardens stand quiet and still under the gathering stars, their carefully tended plants resting undisturbed until tomorrow's returning visitors arrive once more to enjoy them. There is nothing urgent in any of this, only the slow, steady unfolding of one more small and gentle truth. The furnace workers tending these baths through the long night hours performed genuinely demanding, physically taxing labor, feeding fuel steadily into hot, smoky chambers through hours when most of the city slept. A job typically assigned to enslaved workers, whose difficult, largely unrecorded labor made possible the comfortable, celebrated leisure enjoyed by so many thousands of bathers during daylight hours. Historical sources tell us relatively little about these particular workers as individuals, their names and personal stories mostly lost to time in a way that stands in stark contrast to the celebrated architecture and engineering of the baths themselves. A quiet reminder that much of ancient daily life depended on labor history has simply chosen not to remember in detail. Their work nonetheless mattered enormously to the smooth functioning of Roman urban life, since baths that arrived cold and unheated each morning would have quickly lost the popularity and social importance they held so consistently across so many centuries of continuous Roman use. Tonight, careful hands maintaining a warmth that thousands of grateful bathers will enjoy again tomorrow, without ever quite considering where it came from. Rest with this a moment longer, unhurried, before the night carries us softly toward its next quiet detail. Bathing customs regarding gender varied somewhat across different periods and different specific establishments. Some baths offering separate hours or entirely separate facilities for men and women, others permitting mixed bathing under certain circumstances, a matter that occasionally drew comment or mild concern from more conservative Roman moral writers of various eras. Regardless of these particular arrangements, bathing itself remained a thoroughly normal, unremarkable part of daily Roman life for people of essentially every background. A genuinely democratic pleasure in a society otherwise organized quite rigidly around distinctions of class, wealth, and citizenship status. Children, too, were generally welcome at the baths, often accompanying parents or older siblings, learning early the same comfortable, unhurried relationship with public bathing that would continue shaping their daily routines throughout their entire lives within the city. Tonight, the quiet, empty halls we have been visiting hold no trace of this daily human variety, only the patient, echoing stillness of a space built for crowds now resting, however briefly, in genuine and complete solitude. It asks nothing of you now except your calm attention, offered freely, before we drift onward together. Maintenance of these enormous complexes required far more than simply tending furnaces through the night. Since marble floors needed regular cleaning, pools required periodic draining and scrubbing, and the whole vast structure demanded ongoing attention to plumbing, drainage, and general upkeep that a dedicated staff managed carefully behind the scenes, largely invisible to the bathers who enjoyed the finished result each following day. Certain complexes employed specialized workers for particular tasks, some managing the furnaces and hypo-cost system specifically. Others focused on cleaning and general facility maintenance, a division of labor reflecting the genuine scale and complexity of running a facility serving so many thousands of visitors on a completely reliable, daily basis. This careful, largely unseen maintenance work ensured that Rome's baths remained functional and genuinely pleasant across many decades or even centuries of continuous heavy use, a testament to both the quality of the original engineering and the steady, ongoing human effort required to keep such an ambitious system running smoothly. Tonight, this same careful maintenance continues quietly in corners and corridors throughout the darkened complex as always, simply and reliably ready. Such small, steady facts are exactly what this long night is made of, one gentle thought following another. As this chapter of warm water and quiet marble halls draws softly to its close, let the whole grand, hushed shape of the bath settle now in your mind. Vaulted ceilings rising dark and silent above stilled pools, furnace fires glowing steadily somewhere below in patient, careful hands, and gardens resting quiet under gathering stars, until tomorrow's crowds return once more to fill these same halls with conversation and unhurried leisure. This was, in its way, a place where citizens of nearly every background could share, for a few modest coins, in a comfort and a social pleasure that transcended, if only briefly, the many divisions otherwise shaping Roman daily life. There is a particular calm in imagining such an enormous, carefully engineered space resting quietly through the night, its usual warmth and bustle simply paused rather than ended, ready to resume again with tomorrow's first arriving bathers. Carry this same warm, quiet stillness forward with you now as we step out once more into the streets, toward a small tavern near the Forum where a different, livelier kind of nighttime gathering still, even now, continues. Hold this gently for a moment, the way the whole evening itself seems content simply to be held. Not far from the great public buildings of the Forum, tucked into the ground floor of an ordinary insula, a small tavern called Taberna still glows warmly with lamplight. A handful of customers lingering over cups of wine and simple hot food at this late hour. Their low, easy conversations spilling gently out into the quiet street beyond its open doorway. Establishments like this one, sometimes called Popany, sometimes Taberni depending on their particular character and offerings, served as the true dining rooms for a great many ordinary Romans, since the cramped, often kitchen-less apartments we visited earlier left many residents genuinely dependent on such places for a hot meal at the end of a long working day. Wealthier Romans, dining instead in the comfort of their own private homes during a formal evening meal called the cena, generally viewed these humbler establishments with a certain mild social disdain, even as ordinary working residents found in them genuine warmth, community, and simple, reliable comfort after dark. Tonight we step quietly inside the same small, lamplit room, settling for a while among its late, unhurried company. There is a quiet comfort in resting a moment with this thought before we move softly onward. The physical layout of such establishments followed a fairly recognizable pattern across the Roman world. A stone counter facing the street, fitted with large embedded jars called dolia used for storing and serving wine, oil, or prepared foods kept warm or ready for quick, simple serving to customers passing by or settling in for a longer stay. Well-preserved examples surviving in Roman towns elsewhere in Italy show us these counters in remarkable, vivid detail, complete with painted decoration and clear evidence of the daily wear left by countless cups and dishes set down and lifted away again across many years of steady, ordinary use. Behind this counter, a small kitchen area handled whatever simple cooking the establishment offered, while a back room or an upper floor sometimes provided additional seating or occasionally modest lodging for travelers passing through the city without other accommodation arranged. Tonight in the small tavern we have settled into, just such a counter holds several large jars, their contents dispensed steadily throughout the evening to a small, familiar crowd of regular neighborhood customers. Let this small detail settle now, unhurried, before we continue softly on. Wine formed the central offering of nearly every such establishment, typically served watered down considerably from its original strength, since drinking wine entirely undiluted was generally considered excessive, even somewhat uncivilized, by ordinary Roman social standards of the era. Quality and price varied enormously, from cheap, rough local wine affordable to nearly anyone, to finer vintages imported from particular regions renowned for their especially good production. A whole informal hierarchy of taste and expense that ordinary tavern customers navigated according to their own particular means on any given evening. Wine was typically served warm in colder months, sometimes mixed with honey or spices for additional flavor, and cooled with snow or ice when available and affordable during the hotter summer months. A small seasonal variation adding genuine variety to what might otherwise have been a fairly repetitive daily offering. Tonight, cups of modestly priced, well-watered wine continue circulating among the tavern's late remaining customers, each cup refilled steadily from the large jars set into the counter, fueling the easy, unhurried conversation still drifting gently through the small, warm room. It is a small, patient fact, offered gently, with nothing more required of you than simply to listen. Alongside wine, these establishments offered simple, hearty food suited to quick preparation and reliable daily demand. Stews and porridges made from grains and legumes, roasted or boiled vegetables, and occasionally modest portions of meat or fish when supplies and prices allowed for such a relatively costly addition to the ordinary menu. Certain emperors concerned at various points about public order or moral propriety periodically attempted to restrict what these establishments could legally sell, limiting hot food offerings in particular during specific periods. Restrictions that proved, by most historical accounts, genuinely difficult to enforce consistently across a city, with so very many small, scattered taverns operating in every neighborhood. Bread, unsurprisingly, accompanied nearly every meal served in such places, purchased fresh from the very bakeries we visited earlier in our own long night's journey. Its steady, reliable presence linking this small tavern directly to the patient nighttime labor happening simultaneously elsewhere across the city. Tonight, a simple pot of vegetable stew still sits warm near the counter, its modest, comforting aroma mingling with wine and lamp oil in the small room's close, familiar air. Nothing here needs to be remembered carefully, only received quietly, the way this whole night is meant to be received. Games of chance offered popular evening entertainment within establishments like this one, dice, called tesserie, rolled across simple boards or directly onto tabletops, along with strategy games such as Ludus Latrincularum, a board game involving the careful capture of an opponent's pieces that enjoyed real and lasting popularity across many generations of Roman players. Surviving graffiti scratched into walls and pavements throughout the Roman world preserves genuine traces of exactly this kind of casual evening entertainment. Gaming boards etched directly into stone steps or tavern floors, evidence of countless ordinary evenings spent exactly as this one continues to unfold. Gambling for small stakes accompanied many of these games, a modest, generally tolerated form of evening entertainment despite occasional official disapproval, offering tavern regulars a bit of friendly competition alongside their wine and simple conversation. Tonight, in the corner of the small room we have settled into, two regular customers lean over just such a game board, their quiet, focused concentration a welcome, familiar counterpoint to the looser conversation continuing at the counter nearby. Let that settle quietly now, one more small piece of this vast, patient evening slipping softly into place. The clientele of a typical neighborhood tavern reflected the genuine, ordinary diversity of Roman urban life. Laborers and craftsmen finishing a long working day, off-duty soldiers passing through the city, occasional travelers seeking a meal and simple company, and neighborhood regulars for whom this particular counter and this particular company had become a genuinely comfortable, familiar part of daily routine. Conversation in such places touched on nearly every ordinary topic imaginable: local gossip, news from the wider empire, carried by travelers and soldiers passing through unhurried social exchange that has characterized neighborhood gathering places across nearly every era of human history. Tavern keepers themselves, often free citizens running a modest family business, sometimes assisted by enslaved workers handling much of the actual cooking and serving, occupied a respectable if unglamorous place within the city's broader working economy, their small establishments a genuine and valued fixture within their particular neighborhood. Tonight, the tavern keeper we have quietly observed moves steadily between counter and customers, refilling cups and exchanging easy, familiar words with regulars whose faces and preferences he clearly knows well from countless similar evenings before this one. It is enough for now simply to have noticed this calmly before the night moves gently on. Lighting within these small establishments came from the same simple oil lamps we encountered earlier in the quiet Insula apartments, several set carefully around the room to keep the space reasonably bright for customers navigating game boards, counting coins, or simply enjoying one another's company late into the evening hours. The particular warm, flickering quality of this lamplight, combined with wine and easy conversation, gave establishments like this one a genuinely cozy, welcoming atmosphere quite distinct from the grander, more formal spaces of Roman public life, offering ordinary residents a small, accessible pocket of comfort within an otherwise demanding and often difficult daily existence. Smoke from these lamps, along with cooking smoke from the small kitchen behind the counter, would have given the whole room a particular smoky warmth, its walls likely darkened somewhat over years of continuous use by exactly this same gentle, accumulating haze. Tonight, that same warm, smoky lamplight continues glowing steadily within the small tavern's walls, its gentle illumination guiding cups and dice and quiet conversation, alike through these final unhurried hours before the last customers finally, reluctantly head home. Consider it settled now, one more calm, small certainty resting quietly alongside everything else we have gathered tonight. As the hour grows genuinely late, the tavern's remaining customers begin, one by one, to finish their final cups and settle their modest accounts with the keeper, exchanging final unhurried words of farewell before stepping back out into the cooling, torchlit streets we explored earlier, their way home guided by whatever lamp or torch they happened to carry, or simply by long familiarity with streets they had walked countless times before. Some, particularly those living nearby, climbing the same narrow stairs we visited earlier toward rooms where families already lay settled in for the night. Others, arriving from farther across the city or simply reluctant to end a pleasant evening's company, linger a while longer still, the tavern keeper patient and unhurried himself as he moves quietly through the last small tasks of closing for the night. Tonight, this same gentle winding down continues exactly as it does in taverns across the entire sleeping city, each small gathering dissolving gradually, unhurriedly, into the same broader nighttime quiet settling steadily over every street and rooftop alike. This too belongs to the same unhurried rhythm, carrying us gently through the whole of this long night. Not every tavern in the city carried an entirely respectable reputation, since certain establishments, particularly those located near the theater district or catering to a rougher late-night crowd, drew occasional criticism from more conservative Roman writers concerned about drunkenness, gambling, or simple public disorder spilling out from such places into the surrounding streets. Local officials, called aediles, held some responsibility for overseeing public order within the city's neighborhoods, including, on occasion, particular attention to taverns and popani whose late-night activity had drawn genuine complaint from nearby, more sedate residents trying simply to sleep undisturbed. Most establishments, however, including the modest tavern we have spent this part of our evening within, operated as genuinely unremarkable, well-regarded neighborhood fixtures, their late-night gatherings causing little concern beyond the ordinary, familiar murmur any such small community naturally produces. Tonight, this particular tavern settles into exactly that kind of ordinary, unremarkable calm as its final customers depart, its small, warm room finally growing quiet after a long evening of easy company and gentle, familiar conversation. Let this small detail rest easily in your mind now, unhurried and complete, before we continue softly on. As this chapter of wine cups and quiet conversation draws softly to its close, let the whole small, warm shape of the neighborhood tavern settle now in your mind. A stone counter holding its large embedded jars, a game board finally set aside for the night, and lamplight dimming gradually as the keeper finishes his own last careful tasks before finally, himself, seeking rest. This modest, ordinary space, however humble beside the grand marble halls of the Forum standing so near, represented something genuinely essential to countless ordinary Roman lives. A place of warmth, food, and simple human company, available to nearly anyone regardless of their particular means or station. There is a particular comfort in imagining so many such small each one now settling into its own quiet, having offered, for a few unhurried hours, exactly the kind of comfort a long working day so often calls for. Carry this same warm, lamplit room forward with you now as we turn our attention toward the watchmen whose steady, careful patrols keep this same sleeping city genuinely safe through the darkest hours still ahead. Nothing about this needs solving, only noticing calmly, before the night continues its own slow, steady pace. In the year 6 of our era, the Emperor Augustus, addressing a genuine and pressing civic problem, established a permanent, organized force known as the Vigiles, 7 cohorts of roughly 1,000 men each, distributed carefully across the city's 14 administrative regions, tasked primarily with fire prevention and firefighting, alongside a secondary role helping maintain general public order through the long nighttime hours. Before this reform, firefighting in Rome had been handled through far less reliable arrangements, including, in one particularly notorious earlier episode, a private fire brigade organized by the wealthy politician Crassus, whose men reportedly refused to fight fires until property owners agreed to sell their burning buildings at a steep discount. A genuinely troubling practice Augustus's later reform was specifically designed to prevent from recurring. This new patient nighttime patrols becoming a familiar and generally reassuring presence throughout the city's darkened streets. Tonight, somewhere not far from the tavern we just visited, just such a patrol moves steadily along its assigned route, watching carefully for the telltale glow or smell of trouble beginning somewhere among the crowded rooftops nearby. There is no hurry here at all, only the same patient, unhurried pace this whole night has kept from the start. Recruitment into the Vigiles drew heavily from the ranks of freedmen, former enslaved people who had gained their legal freedom, offering these men a genuine path toward eventual Roman citizenship through several years of reliable, disciplined service. A meaningful opportunity in a society that otherwise offered relatively few formal routes toward improved social and legal standing. This arrangement served both parties reasonably well, the state gaining a large, dependable workforce for genuinely demanding and sometimes dangerous night work structured training, and the real prospect of citizenship and its accompanying legal protections at the end of their service. Living quarters for these forces were organized around small local stations called excubatoria, scattered strategically throughout the city's various regions, allowing patrols to respond quickly to trouble arising anywhere within their particular assigned district, rather than traveling long distances from a single central barracks. Tonight, somewhere across the river in the crowded district we know today as Trastevere, one particularly well-documented excubatorium houses a portion of tonight's working force, its walls, remarkably, still bearing traces of graffiti left by the very men who once served there. Let that settle quietly now, one more small piece of this vast, patient evening slipping softly into place. Firefighting equipment carried by these patrols reflected genuinely practical, hard-won experience. Leather buckets and simple hand-operated pumps called siphones for moving water quickly toward a developing blaze. Long hooked poles for pulling burning material away from adjacent structures before flames could spread, and thick fabric mats, sometimes soaked in vinegar, called centones, used to help smother smaller fires before they grew genuinely dangerous. Ladders allowing quick access to upper floors of the tall insulae we visited earlier, buildings whose height made them particularly vulnerable to fires that could spread with terrifying speed through crowded upper stories, reached only by narrow, easily blocked stairways. Training in the use of this equipment, along with basic techniques for evacuating residents safely and containing fires before they could spread to neighboring structures, formed a core part of the ongoing preparation every Vigiles recruit received during his early period of service. Tonight, the patrol moving steadily through the streets near us carries exactly this same practical equipment, buckets and hooks and folded mats ready should tonight, unlike so many quiet nights before it, actually call for their genuine use. It is a small, patient fact, offered gently, with nothing more required of you than simply to listen. Beyond their primary firefighting responsibility, Vigiles patrols also handled a range of secondary duties touching on general nighttime public order, watching for runaway enslaved people, breaking up disturbances or minor disputes that might otherwise escalate unchecked through the dark hours, and generally providing a visible, reassuring presence for residents making their way home late from taverns, baths, or evening social engagements across the sleeping city. This combined role meant that an ordinary Roman resident encountering a Vigiles patrol on a dark street might expect assistance with almost any manner of nighttime difficulty, from a genuine emergency to simple directions home for someone unfamiliar with a particular neighborhood's winding, unlit streets. The force operated under the overall authority of a senior official called the Praefectus Vigilum, appointed directly by the emperor and responsible for coordinating the 7 cohorts' activity across the entire city. A genuinely significant administrative responsibility, given the scale and importance of the service these men provided. Tonight, the patrol we have been quietly following pauses briefly to offer simple directions to a traveler clearly uncertain of his way steadier nighttime responsibility. Nothing here needs to be remembered carefully, only received quietly, the way this whole night is meant to be received. The night itself was divided, according to long-standing Roman military tradition adapted for this civilian force, into 4 watches called vigiliae, each lasting roughly 3 hours, their exact length shifting somewhat with the changing seasons, since the Romans measured nighttime hours as a simple fraction of the actual time between sunset and sunrise, rather than using the fixed 60-minute hours familiar to us today. Officers responsible for each watch used water clocks, called clepsydri, to track the passage of time through these dark hours with reasonable accuracy. A genuinely clever mechanical solution to timekeeping in an era without any reliable substitute for the sundial's usefulness, which of course required daylight to function at all. This careful division of the night into distinct, measured watches allowed the vigiles to maintain continuous, reliable coverage across every single hour of darkness, with fresh patrols relieving tired ones at regular, predictable intervals throughout the long night. Tonight, somewhere within one of the city's excubatoria, marking the careful transition that will soon bring a fresh patrol out to relieve the tired, watchful men we have been following through these earlier hours. Let it settle now, slowly and completely, before we turn our attention to whatever waits gently ahead. The genuine danger this force worked constantly to prevent had been demonstrated with terrible clarity during the Great Fire of the year 64, under the Emperor Nero, which burned for several days and destroyed or badly damaged a substantial portion of the city. An event that, whatever its precise causes, and however it has been remembered and mythologized since, left a lasting and very real impression on Roman civic memory regarding the genuine dangers their crowded, largely wooden and mud brick city faced constantly. Reforms following this disaster included wider streets in rebuilt districts, restrictions on building materials and shared walls between structures, and continued strong support for the vigiles themselves, whose steady nighttime vigilance represented the city's single most important ongoing defense against a repeat of such widespread devastation. Fires, even smaller ones contained quickly and successfully, remained a routine and genuinely serious concern throughout Roman urban history, a constant background risk that the vigiles' patient, unglamorous nightly work helped keep, for the most part, safely and successfully in check. Tonight, thanks largely to their continued careful watching, genuinely and reliably safe. There is nothing urgent in any of this, only the slow, steady unfolding of one more small and gentle truth. Life within the vigiles carried its own particular rhythms and traditions, recruits training together, sharing quarters within their assigned excubatoria, and developing the kind of close, practical camaraderie that difficult, shared nighttime work naturally tends to produce among the people performing it side by side. Surviving inscriptions and graffiti from several excavated excubatoria preserve genuine traces of these men's ordinary lives, names, brief personal notes, and even simple drawings left behind during quiet moments between patrols. Small, human fragments surviving remarkably from lives otherwise mostly unrecorded by more formal historical sources. Promotion within the force offered ambitious or particularly capable men a genuine path toward greater responsibility and status. Senior officers overseeing larger groups of patrols and coordinating more directly with the Praefectus Vigilum's broader citywide command structure. Tonight, within the quiet excubatorium we visited earlier, a handful of off-duty men rest quietly between their own assigned watches, their simple, practical fellowship a small but genuine comfort amid work that, however routine most nights proved, always carried at least the possibility of genuine and sudden danger. Rest with this a moment longer, unhurried, before the night carries us softly toward its next quiet detail. Beyond fires themselves, the vigiles also watched carefully for other nighttime hazards affecting the crowded, aging city, structural collapses of poorly maintained buildings. A genuine concern given the sometimes questionable construction quality of certain insulae we discussed earlier, and general accidents involving the heavy nighttime cart traffic moving steadily through streets that offered pedestrians relatively little protection or warning in the dark. Their patrols therefore required genuine, careful attentiveness across a whole range of potential concerns, not merely watching for smoke or flame, but remaining generally alert to anything within their assigned district that might threaten the safety or order of the sleeping residents, depending, whether they fully realized it or not, on this steady nighttime vigilance. This broad, practical responsibility meant that Vigile's service demanded real skill, a genuinely meaningful achievement for the freedmen who made up the great majority of this dedicated force. Tonight, the patrol we have followed through much of this chapter continues its own careful, attentive circuit, watching, as always, for anything at all that might disturb the otherwise settled, sleeping calm of the streets and buildings entrusted to their steady care. It asks nothing of you now except your calm attention, offered freely, before we drift onward together. As the deepest part of the night settles fully over the city, the Vigile's presence becomes, if anything, even more genuinely important, since these darkest, quietest hours offered both the greatest temptation for anyone inclined toward mischief and the greatest danger should a fire begin unnoticed, while most of the city's residents lay deeply, unknowingly asleep. Patrol routes were designed with exactly this concern in mind, ensuring that no street or block went too long without at least the reassuring, steady sound of a passing patrol's careful footsteps. This constant, patient repetition, walking the same streets again and again through hour after quiet hour, formed the true, largely unglamorous heart of the Vigile's actual daily work, far removed from any dramatic firefighting emergency and consisting instead almost entirely of careful, watchful routine. Tonight, that same careful routine continues exactly as it has on countless nights before this one, patrol following patrol through the same familiar streets, their steady presence a quiet, largely unnoticed gift to a whole sleeping city that rarely pauses to consider just how safely and how carefully its rest is actually being protected. Such small, steady facts are exactly what this long night is made of, one gentle thought following another. As this chapter of watchful patrols and careful vigilance draws softly to its close, let the whole steady, protective shape of the Vigile's nighttime work settle now in your mind. Patrol after patrol moving quietly through darkened streets, buckets and hooks ready, should they ever genuinely be needed, and water clocks marking the careful passage of watch after patient watch through the long hours between sunset and the dawn still some distance off. This organized, genuinely innovative force, born from Augustus's own practical concern for his city's safety, offered ordinary Romans something genuinely valuable and often underappreciated: the simple, steady reassurance that their sleep, however deep, was being carefully watched over by men trained and equipped specifically for exactly that quiet, essential purpose. There is a particular comfort in imagining such careful, largely unnoticed by the very residents whose safety it steadily, reliably protected. Carry this same quiet vigilance forward with you now as we turn our attention beneath the streets themselves, toward the hidden channels of water and waste that kept this whole enormous city running smoothly through every single hour, day or night alike. Hold this gently for a moment, the way the whole evening itself seems content simply to be held. Beneath the sleeping streets we have wandered through tonight runs an entirely separate, largely invisible city, a vast network of aqueducts, channels and sewers that supplied ancient Rome with genuinely abundant fresh water, and carried away its waste with an efficiency not matched again in much of the world for well over 1,000 years, following the empire's own eventual decline. The very first of these great aqueducts, the Aqua Appia, was constructed as early as the year 312 before our era, its construction championed by the censor Appius Claudius, beginning a tradition of ambitious hydraulic engineering that would eventually see 11 major aqueducts supplying the city across many subsequent centuries of continued Roman building and expansion. These structures carried water primarily through underground channels called speces for the greater part of their often considerable length, rising above ground onto the famous soaring stone arches only where the natural landscape required it. a practical engineering choice rather than the purely decorative one modern observers sometimes assume. Tonight, deep beneath the quiet, entirely indifferent to whether the city above happens to be busy or resting. There is a quiet comfort in resting a moment with this thought before we move softly onward. The engineering skill required to move water reliably across such enormous distances, some aqueducts stretching well over 50 miles from their mountain springs to the city itself, depended entirely on an extremely precise, carefully calculated gradient, water flowing by gravity alone rather than any mechanical pumping, requiring surveyors and engineers to measure elevation changes with a level of accuracy that still genuinely impresses modern engineers studying their surviving work. Sextus Julius Frontinus, appointed water commissioner or curator aquarum near the end of the 1st century of our era, later wrote a detailed treatise on the entire aqueduct system, providing us today with an extraordinarily thorough first-hand account of exactly how this whole remarkable network was designed, maintained, and administered across the city's many different districts. Water arriving in the city was distributed through a large collection point called a Castellum Divisorium, then channeled onward through a network of pipes and smaller channels toward public fountains, Bath's private homes as well. Tonight, that same carefully calculated gradient continues doing its own patient, invisible work, water moving steadily downhill through channels engineered with a precision that has genuinely outlasted the empire that built them. Let this small detail settle now, unhurried, before we continue softly on. Beneath the streets themselves runs another, equally impressive piece of ancient engineering, the Cloaca Maxima, Rome's great sewer, originally constructed, according to old tradition, under the city's early Etruscan kings as an open drainage channel before later being covered over and expanded into the substantial stone-lined tunnel whose remains, remarkably, still carry water toward the Tiber even today, nearly 2,500 years after its earliest construction. This great sewer served originally to drain marshy, low-lying ground, including the very area that would eventually become the Forum itself, before gradually taking on its broader later role collecting wastewater from baths, public latrines, and eventually private homes as the city's population and its water use both grew steadily across the centuries. The scale of this achievement genuinely impressed even the Romans themselves, tunnels large enough, in places, for a loaded cart to pass through with room to spare. Tonight, that same ancient channel continues its own steady, essential work far beneath the quiet streets above, carrying the city's wastewater onward toward the river exactly as it has done for well over 2,000 patient years. It is a small, patient fact, offered gently, with nothing more required of you than simply to listen. Public latrines, called foraci, connected directly into this broader sewer system, offering communal facilities where rows of stone seats sat positioned above a continuously flowing channel of water carrying waste efficiently away toward the larger network beneath the streets. A genuinely practical solution to sanitation in a densely populated city where private facilities remained, for many ordinary residents, simply unavailable. These public facilities served a genuinely social function alongside their practical one, offering another casual meeting point where neighbors might exchange brief conversation, much as they did at the public fountains we discussed in an earlier chapter, a detail that surprises many modern visitors more accustomed to treating such matters with considerably greater privacy. Sponges attached to short sticks, called tersoria, a practical, if by modern standards, somewhat communal solution that nonetheless represented a genuinely functional approach to a universal human need. Tonight, these same quiet facilities stand largely unused at this late hour, their steady channels of flowing water continuing regardless, patient and constant, exactly as every other part of this hidden hydraulic system continues its own quiet work through the night. Nothing here needs to be remembered carefully, only received quietly, the way this whole night is meant to be received. Beyond the baths and latrines we have already discussed, Rome's abundant water supply reached the city's residents through a genuinely impressive number of public fountains, called nymphea when particularly decorative, scattered throughout nearly every neighborhood, ensuring that even residents unable to afford a private water connection could still access fresh, clean water within a short walk from their own homes. Estimates drawn from Frontinus's own records suggest the aqueduct system supplied the city with an enormous daily volume of water, more per resident than many modern cities manage today, a remarkable achievement reflecting Roman engineering ambition and the abundance of the springs their aqueducts so carefully tapped. This abundance supported drinking water, bathing, decorative fountains, private gardens, and even certain industrial uses. The water flowing onward afterward into the sewer system rather than being conserved in any way modern management might now recommend. Tonight, water continues trickling steadily from fountain after quiet fountain across the sleeping city. Its familiar, gentle sound, one of the most constant and reassuring notes accompanying this entire long night from beginning to end. Let that settle quietly now, one more small piece of this vast, patient evening slipping softly into place. Maintaining this vast underground network required a genuinely substantial, ongoing effort. Dedicated maintenance workers, called aquarii, responsible for inspecting channels, clearing blockages, and repairing damage across a system stretching many miles both within and well beyond the city's own walls. Their careful, largely unseen labor essential to keeping water flowing reliably to every fountain, bath, and home depending upon it. Frontinus himself devoted considerable attention in his own writing to the genuine problem of illegal water taps. Residents or businesses attempting to divert water from the public supply without proper authorization or payment careful monitoring by officials genuinely committed to fair and orderly water distribution across the entire city. This ongoing maintenance work continued through every season, and when genuinely necessary, through the night as well, particularly when a significant blockage or leak threatened to disrupt water supply to an entire district until properly, carefully addressed. Tonight, somewhere within this vast hidden network, routine maintenance continues quietly wherever it happens to be needed, careful hands ensuring that tomorrow's fountains and baths alike will find their water flowing exactly as reliably as it always has. It is enough for now simply to have noticed this calmly before the night moves gently on. The sheer scale of this combined water and sewer system represented one of the single greatest engineering achievements of the ancient world, an integrated network moving water into the city from distant mountains, and then, after its many uses, carrying waste efficiently back out toward the river, all accomplished through gravity, careful gradient, and sustained human effort across many generations of building. This sophistication would not be matched again in much of Europe for well over 1,000 years following Rome's decline, a fact that later travelers visiting the ruins of Roman aqueducts often noted with genuine, wistful admiration for an achievement their own era could not yet reproduce. Modern archaeologists and engineers still study these surviving structures today, learning from techniques and calculations that remain impressive even by contemporary standards, a lasting testament to the patient skill of the Roman engineers who first designed and built them so very long ago. Tonight, this whole remarkable hidden system continues its own steady, patient work exactly as it always has, entirely unconcerned with how many centuries have passed since its first careful construction. Consider it settled now, one more calm, small certainty resting quietly alongside everything else we have gathered tonight. Water's steady presence shaped Roman daily life far beyond its purely practical uses, appearing throughout the city's religious and cultural life as well. Sacred springs and wells associated with particular gods, ritual purification practices requiring clean, flowing water, and the simple aesthetic pleasure so many wealthy households sought through private garden fountains designed purely for their gentle, soothing sound and visual charm. The goddess Egeria, according to old Roman tradition, was associated with a particular sacred spring just outside the city, said to have advised the legendary early king Numa Pompilius, a small mythological detail reflecting the genuinely deep cultural importance water held for Romans well beyond its obvious practical necessity. This blending of practical engineering and genuine cultural water representing, in its abundant, carefully managed flow, something the Romans themselves clearly took real pride and comfort in maintaining so consistently well. Tonight, that same water continues its quiet, steady journey through fountain and channel and hidden sewer alike, carrying with it, in its own patient way, echoes of both the practical and the sacred meaning it has always held for this particular, water-loving city. Rest with this a moment longer, unhurried, before the night carries us softly toward its next quiet detail. Beneath the sleeping city's quiet streets, then, an entire separate world of steady motion continues through every single hour of this long night. Water descending gradually along carefully calculated channels from distant mountain springs, passing through fountains and baths and private homes alike, before finally, patiently, completing its long journey through the ancient Cloaca Maxima and out into the waiting, equally patient Tiber. This hidden mechanism operated entirely independent of whether Rome's residents happened to be awake or asleep, working or resting, its steady, gravity-driven flow continuing at precisely the same patient pace through the darkest hour of night as through the busiest moment of a crowded daytime market. There is something genuinely comforting in considering just how much careful, reliable infrastructure worked quietly on behalf of this sleeping city, while its residents themselves knew nothing of it at all, trusting, largely without a second thought, that water would simply be there each morning exactly as it always had been the morning before. Tonight, this same trust continues entirely justified steadily, patiently, without any need for notice or thanks from the sleeping city it faithfully serves. Let this small detail rest easily in your mind now, unhurried and complete, before we continue softly on. As this chapter of hidden channels and patient engineering draws softly to its close, let the whole quiet, steady shape of Rome's underground water system settle now in your mind. Aqueducts carrying fresh water in steady streams from distant mountains, fountains trickling gently in nearly every neighborhood, and the great old Cloaca Maxima carrying the city's waste patiently onward toward the waiting river below. This remarkable, largely invisible achievement, sustained across many centuries by careful engineers and patient maintenance workers alike, allowed an enormous city to function smoothly, and by ancient standards, remarkably cleanly, a genuine gift to daily life that most residents likely took, understandably, almost entirely for granted. There is a particular comfort in imagining such careful, hidden order continuing steadily beneath a sleeping city, unseen and largely unconsidered, and yet utterly essential to everything happening peacefully above it. Carry this same quiet, flowing water forward with you now as we lift our gaze upward at last, away from the streets and channels alike, toward the stars now gathering steadily above every darkened rooftop in the city. Nothing about this needs solving, only noticing calmly, before the night continues its own slow, steady pace. High above the sleeping city, far beyond the reach of its lamps and torches, The night sky spreads out now in its own quiet, patient splendor. Stars gathering steadily across the deepening dark exactly as they have for every single night throughout the whole of human history, entirely indifferent to the busy, complicated civilization spread out so far beneath them. Roman astronomy, inherited largely from earlier Greek tradition and refined through centuries of careful, patient observation, understood the night sky with genuine sophistication, tracking the movement of stars, planets, and the moon with tools and techniques that, while considerably simpler than our own, still reflected real, careful scientific curiosity about the workings of the wider universe. Rooftop terraces atop the grander private homes we visited earlier in our journey offered wealthy Romans a genuinely pleasant vantage point for exactly this kind of quiet stargazing. A peaceful evening pastime enjoyed after the day's business and the evening meal alike had both been properly, comfortably finished. Tonight offering the very same quiet view to anyone, of any station, who simply happens to look upward at the right unhurried moment. There is a quiet comfort in resting a moment with this thought before we move softly onward. The particular arrangement of stars into recognizable patterns, largely adopted from earlier Greek astronomical tradition, gave Romans access to a rich, familiar mythology written directly into the night sky itself. Ursa Major and its companion constellations, the striking form of Orion, and countless other patterns whose stories Roman poets retold with genuine affection and considerable poetic skill across many generations of literary tradition. The poet Ovid addressed the origins of several such constellations directly, weaving careful astronomical observation together with traditional storytelling in a way that made the night sky feel genuinely alive with meaning rather than simply a scattered, random field of distant lights. Manilius, another Roman poet working specifically in the field of astronomical and astrological verse, produced an entire lengthy poem devoted to the movements and meanings of the stars, evidence of just how seriously and how poetically educated Romans engaged with the sky stretching patiently above their busy, crowded city. Tonight, these same old, familiar patterns continue their own slow, steady wheeling overhead, visible to anyone in the sleeping city who happens to glance upward through a rooftop opening or a quiet garden clearing. Let this small detail settle now, unhurried, before we continue softly on. Measuring the passage of time through these dark hours, when the sundial's usefulness ended entirely with the setting sun, required different tools entirely, water clocks called clepsydry marking the steady passage of each night's watches with reasonable, practical accuracy. Their slow, steady drip providing a genuinely useful substitute for the sun's own more familiar daytime guidance. We encountered these same devices briefly already, keeping careful track of the Vigile's 4 nightly watches, though ordinary households, too, sometimes kept a simple water clock for tracking time during longer winter nights when darkness stretched considerably further than the daylight hours surrounding it. The stars themselves offered an additional, if less precisely calibrated, method of tracking time through the night. Certain bright, familiar stars rising and setting at predictable points, marking the rough passage of hours for anyone with sufficient practiced familiarity with their steady, reliable seasonal movement. Tonight, somewhere within the quiet city, both these methods continue their own patient work, water dripping steadily in careful measured vessels, while familiar stars continue their own slow, equally reliable climb across the darkened sky above. It is a small, patient fact, offered gently, with nothing more required of you than simply to listen. Astrology held genuine and widespread popularity throughout much of Roman society. Practitioners called mathematici offering to interpret the movement and position of stars and planets, for clients seeking guidance on matters ranging from important political decisions to simple, personal questions about health, marriage, or business fortune. Emperors themselves took varying, often quite serious interest in astrological guidance, some consulting personal astrologers regularly, while occasionally, when political anxiety ran particularly high, certain rulers moved to restrict or even expel astrologers from the city entirely, wary of predictions that might touch too closely on questions of succession or imperial stability. This widespread fascination with the stars' supposed influence over human affairs reflected a broader Roman cultural tendency to see the heavens as genuinely, meaningfully connected to earthly life rather than simply a distant, unrelated backdrop. An outlook considerably different from many modern, more purely scientific perspectives on the night sky. Tonight, somewhere within the sleeping city, a worried client's questions about tomorrow's business dealings or an upcoming journey may already have been quietly discussed with just such a practiced astrological consultant earlier this same evening. Nothing here needs to be remembered carefully, only received quietly, the way this whole night is meant to be received. Occasional dramatic celestial events, comets appearing unexpectedly in the night sky chief among them, drew enormous popular attention and considerable anxious speculation throughout Roman history, since an unexpected comet was widely believed to signal significant coming change, sometimes fortunate, often ominous, in the affairs of the empire or its ruling family specifically. A particularly famous example occurred following the assassination of Julius Caesar, when a bright comet appeared during games held shortly afterward in his honor, an event his adopted heir Octavian, later known as Augustus, skillfully interpreted and promoted as clear evidence of Caesar's own divine ascension into the heavens themselves. Such events, whatever their true astronomical cause, entered quickly into Roman political and cultural memory, genuinely shaping public perception and imperial propaganda alike in ways that remind us how closely Romans watched and how deeply they interpreted whatever unusual sights their patient night sky occasionally offered them. Tonight, the sky above the sleeping city holds no such dramatic surprise, only its familiar, steady wheel of ordinary stars, quietly continuing their own unremarkable, reassuring nightly journey overhead. Let it settle now, slowly and completely, before we turn our attention to whatever waits gently ahead. Long before the more precise Julian calendar reform, which Julius Caesar himself introduced in the year 45 before our era with considerable input from Greek and Egyptian astronomical expertise, Rome had relied on an older, considerably less reliable lunar-based calendar that required frequent, somewhat haphazard adjustment by officials to keep pace properly with the actual solar year. This earlier system had grown genuinely troublesome over time, drifting noticeably out of alignment with the actual seasons whenever officials responsible for adding occasional extra days neglected or manipulated their duty for political convenience. A problem Caesar's careful reform, based on a fixed 365-day year with an occasional extra day added, finally and lastingly resolved. This new calendar, still recognizably the ancestor of the one most of the world uses today, represented a genuinely significant practical achievement, bringing Rome's official measurement of time into much closer, more dependable harmony with the actual, observable movement of sun and stars alike. Tonight, its careful, reliable structure working steadily in the background exactly as intended, entirely without needing any conscious attention from the sleeping city it serves. There is nothing urgent in any of this, only the slow, steady unfolding of one more small and gentle truth. Roman poets returned again and again to the night sky as a source of genuine literary inspiration. Virgil, in his own great agricultural poem The Georgics, offering practical advice to farmers based partly on the seasonal rising and setting of particular stars. a genuinely useful astronomical calendar woven skillfully into verse, celebrating the rhythms of rural life throughout the changing year. Horace, too, wrote often and fondly of quiet evenings spent simply observing the sky, finding in its steady, unhurried movement a source of genuine philosophical comfort, a reminder of nature's own patient, reliable order standing in gentle contrast to the busier, more chaotic concerns of daily Roman political and social life. This poetic tradition reflects something genuinely important about how educated Romans related to their night sky and outlook. This particular long night's journey has, in its own gentle way, been quietly honoring throughout. Tonight, somewhere within the sleeping city, that same old poetic comfort remains available to anyone who simply pauses, as we are doing now, to look upward and consider the same patient stars these long-ago poets once so carefully, so fondly described. Rest with this a moment longer, unhurried, before the night carries us softly toward its next quiet detail. Rooftop gardens and terraces, mentioned briefly already, offered a particularly favored setting for exactly this kind of quiet nighttime reflection. Wealthy households sometimes furnishing such spaces with comfortable couches, specifically for reclining beneath the open sky, enjoying cooler evening air together with genuinely unobstructed views of the stars gathering steadily overhead. Such spaces served social as well as purely contemplative purposes, hosting small evening gatherings where guests might combine quiet conversation, a bit of wine, relaxed evening entertainment considerably removed from the busier, louder pleasures available elsewhere in the city after dark. Even more modest households, lacking any purpose-built terrace, often found their own simple version of this same pleasure on a flat Insula rooftop, stepping up briefly from crowded rooms below to catch a bit of cooler air and a clearer view of the same patient sky enjoyed in rather grander fashion by their wealthier neighbors. Tonight, in gardens and on rooftops scattered across the entire sleeping city, this same quiet pleasure continues unfolding in its own small, scattered way, star by familiar star, for anyone still awake and inclined to notice. It asks nothing of you now except your calm attention, offered freely, before we drift onward together. The moon itself held particular importance across Roman religious and cultural life, associated with the goddess Luna and, in certain contexts, blended together with other related deities, its steady monthly cycle marking time in ways that predated and, in certain cultural and religious contexts, continued alongside the more precise solar calendar Caesar's reform had established. Certain religious festivals and rituals continued to be timed according to the moon's particular phase, a lingering trace of the older lunar calendar's genuine, lasting cultural influence even after its practical, administrative replacement by Caesar's more reliable solar system. Moonlight itself, on clear nights, offered welcome additional illumination for the nighttime travelers, cart drivers, and watchmen we have followed throughout much of this long night's journey, its soft glow supplementing whatever torches and lamps these various nighttime workers carried along their own patient, careful routes. Tonight, whatever phase the moon happens to hold, its familiar, steady light continues offering exactly this same small practical gift to the sleeping city below. One more quiet, reliable presence accompanying every other patient system we have gently explored together tonight. Such small, steady facts are exactly what this long night is made of, one gentle thought following another. As this chapter of stars and quiet rooftop reflection draws softly to its close, let the whole patient, wheeling shape of the night sky settle now in your mind, familiar constellations tracing their same old stories overhead, water clocks marking time in careful measured drip somewhere below, and moonlight, whatever its current phase, offering its own gentle assistance to travelers and watchmen alike, still moving quietly through the sleeping city's darkened streets. This vast, patient sky, studied and storied and quietly enjoyed by Romans of every social station across so many centuries, offered this whole busy, complicated civilization something genuinely valuable. A nightly reminder of order and rhythm considerably larger and more lasting than any single emperor's reign or any single generation's particular concerns. There is a particular comfort in imagining so many Romans, across so many centuries, to look upward together at this same familiar, unhurried sky. Carry this same quiet starlight forward with you now as we turn, at last, toward the first faint signs of morning already beginning, ever so gently, to gather along the eastern horizon. Hold this gently for a moment, the way the whole evening itself seems content simply to be held. Somewhere in the deepest, quietest hour of the night, so gradually that no single sleeping resident could ever quite mark its precise beginning, the eastern sky above the city's rooftops begins its own first, faint transformation, the deep blue-black of full night softening almost imperceptibly toward a slightly paler, more hopeful shade along the very lowest edge of the horizon. Roosters kept by households throughout the city, even within the more crowded residential districts, begin their own familiar, insistent calling at this hour, a sound that has announced the coming of morning in cities across the world for as long as people have kept such birds close to their homes. The great nighttime systems we have followed so patiently throughout this long journey, the cart traffic, the watchful vigiles patrols, the steadily working bakeries, all continue their careful work even now, even as the very first, faintest hints of the coming day begin gathering quietly along the horizon they cannot yet fully see. Tonight's long, patient darkness is not yet finished, but it has at last begun its own gentle, unhurried turn toward morning. There is a quiet comfort in resting a moment with this thought before we move softly onward. As this first pale light gradually strengthens, the ritual of the salutatio begins stirring in wealthier households across the city, an old and genuinely important Roman social custom in which clients, men of lesser social and political standing, bound by mutual obligation to a wealthier, more powerful patron, gathered at their patron's home in the very earliest hours of the morning to offer greetings, seek favors, or simply demonstrate their continued loyalty and respect. This daily ritual, deeply embedded in Roman social and political life, required clients to rise genuinely early, often before full daylight, where they might wait, sometimes for a considerable while, for their brief, formal audience. Patrons, in turn, were expected to receive these morning visitors with appropriate courtesy, offering small gifts or favors in exchange for the political and social support their gathered clients represented, a genuinely reciprocal, if clearly unequal, relationship woven throughout the whole structure of Roman public life. Tonight, in the very last of its darkness, servants in more than one grand household are already beginning quiet preparations for exactly this coming ritual, lamps being lit and reception rooms readied for the earliest arriving clients. Let this small detail settle now, unhurried, before we continue softly on. Down near the forum itself, market vendors are beginning their own early preparations well before full daylight arrives, carts having delivered fresh produce, fish, and other goods through the night exactly as we observed several chapters ago. Stallholders now arranging their wares carefully in the growing pale light in anticipation of the day's very first customers, who typically arrived remarkably early by our own modern standards. The great covered markets and open forums where Romans purchased their daily food and household goods depended entirely on the steady rhythm of nighttime delivery followed by early morning setup, a system so consistent and so reliable that ordinary residents rarely had cause to think consciously about the considerable coordinated effort making their morning shopping trip possible at all. Fishmongers in particular needed to sell their goods quickly after arrival, since fish spoiled rapidly in the Roman climate without any reliable means of refrigeration, giving the very earliest hours of the market day a particular urgency and bustle distinct from the more leisurely trading that would follow later in the morning. Tonight's long darkness began filling these same familiar spaces. It is a small, patient fact, offered gently, with nothing more required of you than simply to listen. The bakeries we visited earlier in our long journey are, by this hour, reaching the very culmination of their patient night's work, the last batches of bread emerging warm and fragrant from ovens that have cycled steadily through the darkness, loaves being counted, stacked, and prepared now for distribution to the neighborhoods and public storehouses depending on their steady, reliable arrival. This final stretch of bakery work represented grain ground, dough kneaded and risen, ovens heated and managed with practiced skill, all of it culminating precisely now, in these final dark hours before dawn, in bread ready to feed an entire waking city. Tired bakers, having worked through the whole night exactly as we witnessed them beginning their labor several chapters earlier, allow themselves perhaps a brief, well-earned moment of rest, even as their finished work is carried out to waiting customers and public distribution points scattered across the city. Tonight, that same warm, satisfying scent of finished bread drifts now from bakery after bakery throughout the city, a fragrant, tangible signal that this long night's patient labor is, at last, very nearly complete. Nothing here needs to be remembered carefully, only received quietly, the way this whole night is meant to be received. Unlike the wheeled cart traffic we discussed earlier, restricted specifically to nighttime hours by Julius Caesar's old municipal law, pedestrian traffic through the city's gates had continued steadily throughout the entire night, meaning that even at this early, still dim hour, a few travelers and early risers are already making their way in and out of the city along roads that never, in truth, stood entirely empty across the whole long night we have shared together. Farmers from the surrounding countryside, bringing fresh produce toward the city's markets for direct sale, often time their own journeys to arrive right around this hour, joining the steady flow of goods already delivered by the professional nighttime cart traffic, and adding their own smaller, more personal contribution to the city's daily supply of fresh food. This gradual each system handing smoothly off to the next without any true, complete pause in the city's constant underlying activity. Tonight, as darkness finally, gradually loosens its hold, this same overlapping handoff continues exactly as it always has, one steady rhythm easing gently into the next without any hard, sudden boundary between them. Let that settle quietly now, one more small piece of this vast, patient evening slipping softly into place. The sun itself, when it finally does appear, will rise somewhere beyond the eastern hills, its first true light catching first upon the highest points of the city, the Capitoline Hills' great temple to Jupiter chief among them, before gradually spreading downward and outward across rooftop after rooftop, until the whole crowded valley between the 7 hills stands once more fully, brightly illuminated. This same daily transformation, however ordinary and however many thousands of times it had already occurred across Rome's long history by the particular night we have shared together in various religious contexts, as a small but meaningful renewal worth acknowledging with appropriate quiet respect. Temple priests in more than one of the city's sacred precincts were, even now, likely preparing for morning rituals that would properly mark and honor this same daily return of light, continuing religious traditions considerably older than the particular imperial era our own composite night has gently borrowed from. Tonight's own long darkness, having carried us patiently through so many separate chapters of this ancient city's hidden nighttime life, now stands genuinely close to exactly this same familiar, welcome transformation. It is enough for now simply to have noticed this calmly before the night moves gently on. The Vigile's patrols we followed several chapters earlier are, by this hour, completing their final watch of the long night, tired but satisfied in all likelihood that their careful vigilance has once again successfully protected the sleeping city from fire or serious disorder through every single one of the night's 4 measured watches. Fresh patrols, or in some cases simply the day's ordinary civic officials, would soon take up whatever daytime responsibility for public order the city required properly rest after hours of steady, careful attention to streets, now beginning to stir with the earliest signs of the coming day's activity. This handoff between night and day, between the Vigile's careful nighttime watching and whatever daytime order the city's regular officials maintained, represented one more small, largely unremarked transition within the city's broader, continuous daily rhythm. Each system's responsibility easing smoothly into the next without any true gap in the city's overall careful protection. Tonight, somewhere within the excubatoria scattered across the city, tired watchmen are already beginning to settle into their own well-earned rest, their long night's careful work now, at last, genuinely finished. Consider it settled now. One more calm, small certainty resting quietly alongside everything else we have gathered tonight. Within the tall Insula we visited earlier in our journey, households across the city are beginning their own quiet stirring. Residents waking gradually to the same pale early light now spreading slowly across the crowded rooftops outside their small, shuttered windows. The long night's rest, however comfortable or however disturbed by the rumble of passing carts, finally drawing toward its own natural, unhurried close. Water carried up the previous evening sits ready for the morning's first small tasks, while somewhere nearby, fresh bread, delivered from exactly the bakeries whose long night's work we followed so closely, waits to provide the simple foundation of another day's first modest meal. This same gentle waking, repeated in countless separate rooms across the entire crowded city, represents the true purpose behind an enormous, complicated system of nighttime labor and careful maintenance. A system existing, ultimately, simply to allow an entire ordinary city to wake each morning safely, comfortably, and reliably fed. Tonight's own long journey draws toward this same gentle culmination now. Countless separate households stirring quietly awake within the same great sleeping city we have wandered through together for so many patient hours. Rest with this a moment longer, unhurried, before the night carries us softly toward its final quiet detail. The forum itself, standing empty and quiet through so much of the night we have shared together, begins now to fill gradually with its first early visitors. Officials arriving for the day's business, vendors finishing their careful morning setup, and ordinary residents beginning to move through its ancient, familiar spaces exactly as countless generations of Romans have done before them across so many centuries of continuous, remarkable use. This same gradual filling, quiet and unhurried at first before building steadily toward the fuller daytime bustle we have not attempted to follow, belongs properly to the day now beginning, and not to this particular gentle night's journey, which is finally drawing toward its own natural close. Every system we have quietly observed across this whole long journey, the cart traffic and the lamplit apartments, the patient bakeries and the quiet baths, the careful watchmen and the hidden water flowing steadily beneath every street, has led, each in its own particular way, toward exactly this same gentle, reliable moment. An ordinary Roman morning beginning once again, precisely as it always has. Let this whole long night settle now, complete and unhurried, before we allow it gently to finally close. Nothing more needs to be added to this thought tonight, only the quiet permission to let it rest. And so our long night in ancient Rome draws softly, finally to its close, the sun risen fully now above the eastern hills. The 7 hills and their crowded valleys bathed once more in familiar morning light, every quiet system we have wandered through together. The nighttime carts and the lamplit insulae, the patient bakers and the sleeping baths, the watchful vigiles and the hidden water flowing steadily beneath every stone, having done its own steady, essential work through all the hours we have shared. This ancient city, so very far removed from us now in time and yet, in so many small human particulars, still genuinely familiar, woke this morning exactly as it did on countless mornings before this one, and would go on waking in the same patient way for centuries still to come. The carts are rolling out through the gates again, the lamps are being pinched out one by one, the ovens are cooling, and the last of the night watch are walking slowly home along streets already filling with ordinary morning business. Nothing about this particular dawn was remarkable, and that was always the point of it. An enormous city simply doing again what it had quietly learned to do every night and every morning, without anyone needing to think about it at all. Let this whole long night rest now, complete, from the first cart at dusk to this last pale light on the stones. Thank you for spending these quiet hours here with us, drifting gently through one long imagined night in ancient Rome, from the first heavy carts rolling in at dusk all the way through to this pale morning light on the paving stones. If sleep found you somewhere along the way, in the lamplit stairways of an insula, or in the warm dark of the empty baths, or somewhere out on a rooftop under the old familiar constellations, then this whole unhurried journey did exactly what it was always meant to do. Rest well now, carried gently by that same old patient rhythm of dusk and lamplight and slow returning dawn. We will look forward to meeting you again for another quiet night very soon. QC, chapters equals 10 facts equals 100 words equals.